Hi everyone, this is a Barclay Damon live broadcast where we discuss all things L&E, labor, and employment. I'm Ari, let's dig in.
All right, everybody. So you're sitting there and you're listening and you're thinking, you know what? That voice doesn't sound like Ari. Or if you're watching, you're thinking, did Ari go and get a perm and change the color of her hair? And the answer is no, she didn't. Where in the world is Ari? Ari is actually on her honeymoon. So she got married over 2 years ago, and because of the pandemic, it just kept getting pushed and pushed and pushed. So she was finally able to do it, and so she reached out to Rosanna and I should say Berardi Immigration, and said, hey, can the three of you take it from here? And we said, heck yeah, we can take it from here. So for those of you who have listened to our podcast in the past, my name is Rosemary Enright. I'm an attorney with Barclay Damon. I'm the practice group leader for our labor and employment group. So if you're new, welcome. If you've listened before, welcome back. And I am thrilled to have my dear friend and partner, Rosanna Berardi, back with us from Berardi Immigration. Welcome, Rosanna.
Always great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and you know, we're going to try to stick Rosanna with Ari's format. So she always likes a fun fact. So what fun fact do you want to share with our listeners today?
So I'm Rosanna Berardi, Berardi Immigration Law, and at the beginning of my very lengthy immigration career, I attended the Federal Law Enforcement Training Academy in Glencoe, Georgia. Very cool experience, but glad I did it. Really cool. And makes for a good fun fact.
Yeah, that's a great fun fact. Well, thanks for sharing that with us, Rosanna. So while Rosanna and I could just sit here and shoot the breeze for the next 15 or 20 minutes, we know that you actually want to hear about how to sponsor an employee. So we'll just dig right in, okay? We'll jump in, Rosanna. So the first thing, you know, as you know, immigration is not in my wheelhouse. I know just enough to be dangerous, and what that means is call Rosanna. So the first question I have, and I suspect many of our listeners have, is what does it mean to sponsor an employee? What is that?
Yeah, so it's interesting, especially right now, we're living in the time of the Great Resignation, and, every employer under the sun is having a hard time finding workers. So much so that we're seeing a huge increase in our business where companies are calling us saying, hey, I can't find any Americans. How do I get this Canadian, engineer to come into the United States? So we then start talking about sponsoring that person. The U.S. immigration system is a sponsorship-based system, meaning that if you are Joe Smith from Toronto and you want to work in the United States, you can't just drive across the border and work. You need a sponsor. And that sponsor can either be an immediate family member, like a spouse or a parent that's a U.S. citizen, or an employer. So for purposes of the podcast, we're going to talk about employer sponsorship. That means an employer has met you, liked you, feel that you're qualified for their job opening, and that you're going to come and work in the United States by way of sponsorship.
So Rosanna, so am I correct in saying then that I like the way you said it, that the employer has met you and likes you and wants to sponsor you. So I guess this means this would come up maybe after a conditional offer of employment has been made? Is that the way?
It comes up in a couple of different ways. So sometimes employers will be super proactive and call and say, I'm thinking of interviewing this gentleman from Canada or India. Can I do this? Like, how does this work? What is involved? So we'll get those proactive calls, or we'll get someone that calls that says, we found this candidate, we've made a conditional offer, and we'd now like to sponsor him or get him on our payroll. So we get a lot of calls. It's always nice to get the proactive ones so we can kind of guide the process. But, not everybody knows. And particularly with Canadians, we're such good neighbors and trading partners. There's just a lot of misinformation out there that, you can just bring Canadians in. But newsflash, Canadians are like everyone else from outside of the United States. Yes, they do get some special benefits, but overall, they are required to be sponsored like everyone else, China, India, Pakistan, Philippines.
Right. Well, and you can see how that would be confusing, Roseanne. I mean, we go back and forth, right? We've gone
Yes.
over to, Niagara on the Lake, or we go up to
Yes.
Toronto to see some of, our friends and colleagues and that.
Mhm.
And so you just think, oh, I can just go back and forth. So why couldn't somebody, let's just say, commute from Canada and
Right.
work here? And actually, that's a good question. Could somebody do that? Could they
Yes.
commute and go back and forth? But do they still have to be sponsored to do that?
They do. They do. And a great example of that is here in the Buffalo area. We have a lot of medical hospitals right over the border, and a lot of those hospitals sponsor Canadian nurses, respiratory technicians. And so I have clients that are Canadians that live in St. Catharines, but they drive to ECMC every day for work. And given the proximity, it's a half-hour drive. It's not really any different than any other commute. So we have a lot of what we call cross-border workers and travelers in the Western New York community. And, it is really a great way to enhance your recruitment and hiring process, especially right now where the well is so dry with US workers.
Yeah.
We have a lot of companies hiring foreign nationals.
Yeah. And so what does it mean, or like what is the process? So let's say you get that proactive call. And again, I mean, there are probably year-long courses in this, but just at a high level so that people
Yeah.
understand, what is the sponsorship process?
So sponsorship process varies depending on the visa classification. And the visa classification begins with the letter A, like the alphabet, and goes all the way to the letter U. And in between A through U, every letter stands for a different way of coming into the United States. So letter A is for ambassadors, letter B is for business visitors, letter C is a crewman, and it goes down the whole alphabet. So those are,
Seriously? The whole
yeah, seriously,
alphabet?
up to letter U. So, what is that? 20 something categories.
Wow.
And each category has its own separate rules for sponsorship. So, for purposes of the podcast, the most common ones we see, there's a category for the letter T. The T is for TN. That's a visa classification under the NAFTA treaty. That's for our Canadian and Mexican friends to come to the United States to work in one of the occupations listed on the NAFTA treaty. So if you are a hospital here in Western New York and you have a registered nurse who's a Canadian applicant and you want to hire that registered nurse, as the sponsor, you need to not only give her a traditional job offer, but one that's contingent on immigration approval. And then you need to hire Berardi Immigration Law to do the actual application, which is an application that will talk about the job, the company, the registered nurse, all of her qualifications, how she meets the criteria under the law. So again, super high level view, but there are 20 something different categories, different rules, but essentially the employer is saying, registered nurse Susie, I want to hire you. I'm going to go on record with the federal government and offer you this position here at our hospital.
Got it. Okay. Well, so let's say that the hospital gets however many months, because I assume it takes months, Rosanna. Like, how long does it take?
Well, so the TN category is quick. That only takes weeks, but everything else takes months and months and months.
Months and months. Okay.
Yeah.
So, all right. So let's pretend then that they're going to go with the TN. So it's just weeks or something like that. And at the end of the first week, the hospital suddenly says, you know what? We're not going to move forward with this. Like, can they just say, you know what? We're backing out. I don't know what the right word would be, but you know what I mean? End the process.
They can withdraw the application. So under the immigration rules, it's very similar to the concept of employee at will, which, as you know better than anyone, New York State is an employee at will state where you don't need to have a severance package or any cause for termination. You could terminate the person. Immigration concept, very similar, but for one of the 20 something categories. The immigration concept is if the person no longer fits the position or isn't a good fit, you can terminate the work permit by contacting the immigration service saying this person is no longer working for us, because each work permit is employer specific. So The nurse at ECMC can't take that TN and go to Buffalo General Hospital or a hospital in Ohio to work. It's employer specific. So yes, you can withdraw it, you can cancel it, and you can terminate the employment. The only thing different, just as a fun fact for H-1B purposes, is if you terminate the person, you have to give them a one-way ticket back to their home country. Just under that category.
That's kind of mean.
I know. One way. Bye. See ya.
Bye-bye. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. Oh my gosh. Okay.
Yeah, so that's kind of a little quirk. But yeah, overall, when we tell employers about how sponsorship works, we say, don't worry if it doesn't work out. You can always switch gears here.
Yeah, so it is. So if it doesn't work out, they can, and at any point, and they just then notify, as you said, that this person doesn't work here, they're not a good fit or something like that. Let's say that the nurse at ECMC is doing a great job. How long does it last, Rosanna? Is it like forever until you, and I know in my world, I always say, don't use permanent, don't use forever.
Yes.
But how long does it last, the sponsorship and their ability to?
So again, it's dependent on the classification that we bring the person in. So for example, the TN, the government will issue it in 3-year increments. Now for the TN, you can keep getting 3 years, 3 years, 3 years. There's no final cap. So I have some clients that have held TN status for 15 years. They just go every 3 years. However, there are other categories like the H-1B or the O-1 that are timed out. The H-1B, 6 years max. The L-1, 7 years max. So there's no such thing as permanent. And I tell employers that call me, don't promise the moon and the stars to this applicant. Don't say, we'll get you a green card. You can stay here forever. A green card is something totally different. Very, very complex process. And I always say, this is like dating. Make sure you like the person. The work categories that you're sponsoring, that's like a date. Where the green card is the marriage, right? You don't want to jump to the marriage before you've dated. So let's just try these temporary categories first. And, we can go through an analysis of how long the person can be here. And so it is, it's an extra layer. It's an extra set of fees to hire a foreign national. And, people that aren't familiar with this area will say, oh, well, companies, they just want to hire foreign workers because it's cheaper. And I go crazy and say, absolutely not. It costs a small fortune. It is very cumbersome. If they could hire U.S. citizens all day, they probably would. But there are gaps in our employment and labor market, so we turn to foreign labor. And there's wonderful foreign nationals available. But it is another layer to the traditional hiring process.
Yeah, and so you mentioned it costs a small fortune. So who does pay for the sponsorship, Rosanna? Is it I assume it's the employer?
In general, yes. Now, some of the categories will, it's silent on who can pay. The H-1B category requires the employer to pay. The message from Congress is if you want this person, you're going to pay for it. Now on the TN, the regulations are silent. So the employee or the employer can pay. And sometimes when I'm counseling employees, I'll say, you might want to ask for this as part of your offer package, that the employer covers the fees. So it's inconsistent across the board, but usually, the employer will foot the bill.
Okay, got it. All right, and so I think. Oh, I know. So in terms of the renewal, when you said you've got that one who's been here 15 years and they just every 3 years.
Yep.
Renew again. So is it a whole long process? Is it as expensive and filling out all the forms again or the application? I mean, how extensive or difficult is that?
So it's a little bit easier the second go around than the initial application, but it's still the process and procedures. So, I mean, we charge a little bit less for the extension applications, but in terms of the timing and the process, you've got to do the case all over again because the government wants to be updated. What's changed? Are there additional duties, additional responsibilities? What's the offered salary? I mean, the U.S. immigration law, it's old, okay? It hasn't been meaningfully updated since 1997. Okay?
Holy cow.
We hear about this all the time. About the law changes. I'm like, nope, excuse me. The law has not changed since 1997.
That's amazing.
What we talk about is policy changes. So, when President Trump was elected, they're like, oh, the law changed. I'm like, the law didn't change one iota. The policies changed. And every administration will change their policies. But we have this very old, antiquated law from 1997 that is very inflexible, and it is very protective of U.S. workers. There are built into these 20 odd categories. Employers have to show that they're paying the foreign national a prevailing wage, meaning that the American sitting next to them at lunch is being paid the same as the foreign national employee. So there's no wage discrimination. The law is very protective, and it's restrictive, and it's complicated. Now, getting back to our Canadian friends quickly, there is a lot of like, well, can I just come in? I'm from Canada. And conversely, the Canadian immigration law system is much more liberal and much more flexible. So Americans that go to work in Canada, it's a lot easier for them. We have one of the most restrictive immigration law in the world. And because of that, it is very complex. And I've been doing this. This is my 25th year, and I have never been bored 1 second of my career because this is a complicated area. Policies are ever changing. It's so emotionally charged because it's someone's livelihood and their life. And it's what I love about it. But it is complex. And, a good takeaway from the podcast is really proactive, think ahead. This can be done, but it takes a lot of strategic planning. It might not be done in the time that you want it, but we can get most people in.
Wow. So I have to say, Rosanna, that was a perfect close. So I don't have to summarize or come up with anything. That was great. Thank you. Although I will say you did a great job of teeing up another podcast that Rosanna and I are going to be doing, talking about foreign nationals. So, tune in for that. I don't know, that might be in the next couple of weeks, but I'll say, Rosanna, thank you so much for your time. And, I can't agree more. Your world, I mean, all of our worlds, what we do, it's individuals' livelihoods, it's their life. But in this, someone might be leaving their family and their home country to come here. And that's on you, right? And your firm. And so that's a lot. So
it's a lot. I love that part of it. I love, making people's American dreams come true, but it's very complicated and stressful. And if you're not embedded in this like I am every day, you don't realize what people go through and how complicated it truly is to be here. And it's to me, it's such a blessing that I get to do this every day, but it is complicated. And, our role here is to make it easy. We get companies that call us all the time and say, well, can I do this myself? I say, well, technically you could, but it's like doing a complex federal income tax return. Like, why would you do that?
Right.
And the risk involved is someone's life.
Right.
So yes, you could try, and then people try and they call us, and it's 10 times harder. So
that's right, because then you got to unwind it all, which happens all the time. Yeah. So
for sure.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Rosanna, for your time, and we'll talk again soon.
Excellent. Thank you.
Bye-bye. The Labor Employment Podcast is available on barclaydamon.com, YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Like, follow, share, and continue to listen. Thanks. This material is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice or a legal opinion, and no attorney-client relationship has been established or implied. Thanks for listening.